There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists after something enormous has ended, and tonight that is where the story begins. Settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your breath slow, and let me tell you about a night that happened so long ago that the number itself barely means anything anymore, and yet everything that followed, including you, including this room you are lying in, traces back to it. Something is dying tonight, and almost everything alive on Earth is about to lose the only world it has ever known. In the hours after this story opens, 3 out of every 4 species on the planet will be gone, and the animals that have ruled every forest, every coastline, and every open plain for longer than is easy to imagine will not survive to see what comes next. This is not a story about a single death. It is a story about the death of an entire age, and about the small, unlikely things that were left to carry life forward once it ended. Picture a narrow burrow dug into soft earth beneath the roots of a conifer, somewhere in what will one day be the plains of North America. Inside it, curled into the dark, is a creature small enough to fit into the palm of a hand, with a long snout, a coat of coarse fur, and a heartbeat going faster than it has ever gone before. She is not a mouse, not quite though. If you saw her by torchlight, you might mistake her for one. She belongs to a quiet, mostly overlooked branch of early mammals, one of dozens of small, warm-blooded creatures who have spent the entire age of dinosaurs doing precisely what she is doing now, staying hidden, staying small, staying alive by staying unnoticed. Above her, the world has just been struck by something that arrived faster than sound, and the forest she knew hours earlier does not exist anymore. She does not know what has happened. She only knows that the ground shook in a way ground is not supposed to shake, that the light outside turned strange and then vanished, and that the air pushing down into her burrow smells of smoke and scorched resin. She presses herself deeper into the dark, breathing shallow, waiting. She has no way of understanding that the animals who have made the world dangerous for creatures like her for 150 million years are in this same hour beginning to die in numbers too large to comprehend. She only understands the burrow, the dark, and the next breath. And for reasons that still humble scientists today, reasons of size, of habit, of sheer biological luck, she and creatures like her are among the ones who will still be breathing when the smoke finally clears. It is easy, lying comfortably tonight, to forget how strange and total that moment truly was. For longer than humans have existed, longer than most families of animals we would recognize have existed, the world belonged to the dinosaurs. Enormous, feathered, scaled, armored, some larger than any land animal before or since they had filled nearly every ecological role on every continent. To be alive in that world, if you were small, meant living your entire existence in the margins, in the underbrush, in the burrows, in the hours after dark, because the daylight and the open ground belonged to something bigger than you. And then in the space of a single afternoon, that entire arrangement broke. What is remarkable, and what this story will spend the next several hours unfolding, is not simply that the dinosaurs disappeared. It is what took their place in the long, uncertain, often brutal centuries afterward, and how the descendants of quiet, hidden little animals, like the one curled in that burrow, eventually became the ancestors of nearly every mammal alive today, humans very much included. There is something else worth sitting with before we go further, something most people never think to ask. We tend to picture extinction as an instant, a single dramatic strike, and then silence. But the truth, as the evidence buried in rock layers around the world eventually revealed, is stranger and slower than that. Some of the forces that helped end the age of dinosaurs may have already been quietly at work for tens of thousands of years before anything struck the Earth at all, reshaping climates and stressing ecosystems in ways no creature alive at the time could have understood. And the recovery afterward, the slow return of forests of insects, of any kind of stable world, took not years, not decades, but well over 1 million years to complete. This was not a single bad night that the world simply woke up from. It was the beginning of one of the longest, most difficult chapters in the entire history of life on this planet, and it is only now, with satellite imagery, drilled ice cores and fossil beds studied millimetre by millimetre, that we are able to understand what actually happened in anything close to full detail. Before we go further into that world, I want to pause here and say something to you directly, because I mean it. If this is the kind of story you come looking for, the real history told slowly and honestly, without needing to shout to keep your attention, then taking a moment to subscribe and leave a like genuinely helps this kind of storytelling. Keep reaching people who are looking for exactly this, and I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what drew you to this particular story. I read every one, even the late ones, maybe especially the late ones. Now let yourself get comfortable and let's begin. So let us go back past that burrow, past that single frightened creature, and into the world as it existed just before everything changed. It is a world that deserves to be understood on its own terms. First, not simply as a prelude to disaster, but as an extraordinary, fully realized place that lasted for an almost unimaginable stretch of time, filled with creatures whose scale and strangeness still shape the way we picture the ancient past. To understand what was lost and what eventually rose in its place, we have to first understand exactly what kind of world it was that dinosaurs had built, and exactly how brutal, how beautiful, and how precarious life already was underneath their reign, long before anything ever came falling out of the sky. Late Cretaceous North America does not look like anything found on a map today, and that alone is worth sitting with for a moment. The land that will one day become Montana, Alberta, and the high plains of the American West is at this point in Earth's history a low, humid floodplain crossed by wide, slow rivers, sitting on the edge of a shallow inland sea that splits the continent nearly in two. The climate is warmer than anything we know now, warm enough that palm trees grow at latitudes where today snow falls for half the year. It is in almost every sense a lush and generous world. It is also, if you were small, one of the most dangerous places life has ever produced. To understand what it actually felt like to be alive here, it helps to abandon the picture. Most of us grew up with the one where a handful of famous dinosaurs, a tyrannosaur, a triceratops, a few others, simply stand around in a diorama. The real ecosystem was far stranger and far more crowded than that. Fossil beds in this region have preserved not just the giants, but an entire layered world beneath them, and the deeper scientists dig, the clearer it becomes that dinosaurs did not merely dominate this world, they saturated it, filling nearly every possible ecological role, from apex predators the size of a school bus down to feathered, dog-sized hunters that moved in packs through the undergrowth. There was quite simply very little room left over for anything else to be large or slow or careless. This is the detail that tends to surprise people most when they first hear it for the entire 150 million years or more, that dinosaurs ruled the land. The mammals living alongside them never grew larger than a badger. Not because they lacked the capacity, evolutionarily speaking, but because the world simply would not allow it. Every ecological niche above a certain size was already occupied fiercely and continuously by something with teeth, claws, or sheer bulk on its side. Paleontologists sometimes describe this arrangement as a ceiling, an invisible boundary in the fossil record that mammals pressed against for tens of millions of years and never once broke through. Not because they stopped trying, but because the animals above them would not permit it. It is a strange thing to consider lying here tonight that for almost the entire span of mammalian existence, up to that point being small was not a starting condition. It was the only option. And so life for a creature built along those lines meant living almost entirely by avoidance. The small mammals of this world, shrew-like, mouse-like, some faintly resembling modern opossums, were mostly nocturnal, not by simple preference, but by necessity. since the daylight hours belong to eyes far larger and far more dangerous than theirs. They nested in burrows in fallen logs in the dense cover of ferns and cycads, and their entire evolutionary strategy, if it can be called a strategy at all, was built around being too small, too fast, and too unimportant to be worth a predator's attention. It is worth pausing on how strange that inheritance is. Every mammal alive today, including every person listening to this right now, descends from animals who survived 150 million years by staying quiet, staying hidden, and never once being the largest thing in the room. Meanwhile, above them, the dinosaurs themselves were living lives of a completely different order of scale and complexity. Tyrannosaurus rex, appearing only in the final few million years of this era, was not merely large, it was likely capable of crushing bone with a bite force, among the strongest ever measured. In any land animal, and recent fossil evidence suggests these predators may have hunted not as solitary killers as they are so often portrayed, but in loosely organized groups, at least at certain points in their lives. Triceratops grazing nearby in herds carried a skull shield that could grow to nearly 2 meters across, likely used as much for display in combat between rivals as for defense against predators. And moving through the forests in genuine flocks were smaller feathered dinosaurs whose closest living relatives in the most literal biological sense are not lizards or crocodiles at all, but the birds outside your window right now. This is one of the quieter truths of this story, one that still catches people off guard. Dinosaurs in the strictest scientific sense never actually went extinct. One entire branch of them is still here, has been here this whole time, and is at this very moment likely asleep in a nest somewhere not far from where you're lying. The scale of this world extended into the seas as well, and it is easy to forget when picturing the Cretaceous that the drama was not confined to land. The shallow sea splitting North America in two was home to mosasaurs, marine reptiles that could grow longer than a city bus, moving with a fluid, almost serpentine power through waters filled with ammonites, early sharks, and enormous marine turtles. Above them in the skies, pterosaurs with wingspans rivaling small aircraft rode the coastal thermals hunting fish along the shoreline. Every layer of this world's sky, land, and sea had been claimed, refined, and fiercely defended over tens of millions of years of evolutionary pressure. By any reasonable measure, this was not a fragile ecosystem. It was, if anything, one of the most successful and stable arrangements life had ever produced on this planet. And that success is precisely what makes the coming centuries so difficult to fully explain even now. Scholars still debate exactly how stable this world truly was in its final stretch. For a long time, the assumption was that dinosaurs were thriving right up until the very end. A healthy, diverse world cut short entirely by outside catastrophe. More recent fossil analysis has complicated that picture somewhat. Some researchers now argue that overall dinosaur diversity may have already been gently declining in certain regions during the final few million years of the Cretaceous, perhaps due to shifting sea levels or changing plant life altering what herbivores could rely on for food, while other researchers push back firmly against that reading, pointing to fossil beds that show no clear signs of decline at all. The honest answer, the one worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly, is that we do not yet fully know whether this world was already beginning to strain under its own weight or whether it was right up until its final days as vigorous and dominant as it had always been. Both possibilities remain seriously argued in the scientific literature, and the fossil record, frustratingly, is not yet complete enough to settle the question with certainty. What can be said with more confidence is this. Underneath the sheer grandeur of this world, something quieter had been happening for tens of millions of years, almost entirely unnoticed by the animals living through it. Small, warm-blooded, endlessly persistent, the early mammals of this era were not simply hiding out waiting passively for their moment. They were without any awareness of it being shaped by every single one of those pressures into something extraordinarily adaptable. Living in the margins forces a kind of resilience that living at the top never quite requires. Small body size meant lower food demands during hard seasons. Nocturnal habits meant a nervous system already well suited to operating with limited light and heightened senses. Burrowing behavior meant a built-in strategy for surviving exactly the kind of sudden environmental shock that, in a way none of them could possibly have anticipated, was about to define the rest of their evolutionary story. None of this was preparation, not in any intentional sense. Evolution does not plan ahead. But when the moment came that would end the age of giants, it would not be strength or size or dominance that determined who survived. It would be almost entirely which animals had already spent 150 million years quietly learning how to live through hardship without ever being noticed. It is a strange kind of justice when you think about it that way, lying here in the dark. The very qualities that made these small creatures seem insignificant, even faintly pitiable, next to the towering animals around them, were the same qualities that would carry their descendants forward into every corner of the world that came after. But that reversal was still tens of millions of years away from mattering, and on any ordinary day in this Cretaceous world, dominance still belonged entirely to something else. Somewhere on that same floodplain, a young tyrannosaur is beginning to test the limits of just how much of this world still belongs to her, and the answer for now is almost all of it. To understand how dinosaurs came to rule so completely, we have to go back further than most people expect, back past the world we just left behind into a much older and considerably harsher chapter of Earth's history. Because dinosaurs did not simply appear one day and inherit an empty stage. They fought their way into a world that was already occupied, already recovering from a catastrophe so severe that it makes the story we are building toward look by comparison almost gentle. Roughly 252 million years ago, long before the first dinosaur ever walked the planet, endured what many paleontologists still consider the single worst extinction event in the entire history of complex life. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia poured out lava and gas for what may have been close to 1 million years, acidifying oceans, poisoning the atmosphere, and wiping out somewhere around 90% of all species alive at the time. It is sometimes called quietly and without exaggeration the Great Dying, and it is out of the slow, uncertain recovery from that devastation that the story of the dinosaurs actually begins. In the aftermath, the world belonged at least for a while to an entirely different group of animals. Long before mammals existed in anything like their modern form, the dominant land creatures were a lineage of reptile-like animals called synapsids, distant cousins of the small burrowing mammals we met a little earlier in this story. Some of these synapsids grew remarkably large, remarkably successful, and for several million years after the Great Dying, it looked as though not any ancestor of the dinosaurs, might inherit the recovering world. It is one of the quieter surprises of this era. The animals that seemed poised to dominate the planet were for a time our own distant relatives, not theirs. What changed that trajectory was not a single dramatic event, but a slower, more contested process that scientists are still actively piecing together. Alongside the synapsids, a different group of reptiles had also survived the Great Dying, a lineage known as archosaurs, and it is from within this group that both the ancestors of dinosaurs and separately the ancestors of modern crocodiles eventually emerged. For a stretch of roughly 20 million years, these two lineages, synapsid descended and archosaur descended, effectively competed for the same ecological space, and for a long time it was not remotely obvious which side would win. This is where the historical record becomes genuinely uncertain and where honest scholarship has to resist the temptation to tell a cleaner story than the evidence actually supports. For decades, the popular narrative held that dinosaurs rose to dominance because they were simply superior, faster, smarter, more efficient, outcompeting everything around them through sheer evolutionary excellence. More recent research has complicated that picture considerably. A growing number of paleontologists now argue that dinosaurs may have gotten their opportunity not primarily through competitive superiority but through blind evolutionary luck, surviving a series of environmental crises that happened to devastate their rivals more severely than it devastated them. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. Some fossil evidence from Argentina and elsewhere suggests early dinosaurs were already outcompeting other reptiles on ecological terms well before any major crisis struck, while other evidence suggests their rivals remained just as successful, sometimes more successful, right up until sudden environmental upheavals removed them from the picture almost entirely. It is worth sitting with that uncertainty for a moment because it says something quietly important about how history actually works. Whether we are talking about the history of empires or the history of entire evolutionary lineages, dominance is rarely a clean story of the strong prevailing over the weak. More often it is a story of who happened to be standing in the right place when circumstances shifted. And circumstances did shift dramatically roughly 232 million years ago in an event most people have never heard of, even those who consider themselves reasonably familiar with prehistoric life. It is called the Carnian pluvial episode, and it deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Over a period of roughly 1 to 2 million years, intense and repeated episodes of volcanic activity, this time originating from what is now Western Canada, triggered a series of extreme climate shifts across the planet. Most notably, a dramatic increase in global rainfall that transformed vast stretches of previously arid landscape into humid, forested environments. For reasons still not entirely understood, this shift favoured the early dinosaurs and their closest relatives far more than it favoured the synapsid-descended animals who had until that point still held their ground. Fossil records from before and after this episode show a striking change, dinosaur diversity and abundance increasing sharply in its wake, while many of their former rivals decline or vanish from the record entirely. Some researchers consider the Carnian pluvial episode to be the true beginning of dinosaur dominance, the actual hinge point of this entire story, even though it remains almost completely unknown outside the specialized academic circles. There is something worth noticing in that, lying here tonight, the event that arguably made the entire age of dinosaurs possible does not have a famous name, does not appear in documentaries, and is not part of the story most people learn as children. History, even natural history, does not always preserve its most important turning points in proportion to their actual significance. From that point forward, across the remainder of the Triassic period and into the Jurassic that followed, dinosaurs expanded steadily, though not instantly, into the dominant land animals across the supercontinent of Pangaea. Part of what allowed this expansion once the opportunity presented itself came down to genuine biological advantages that had been quietly developing within their lineage for millions of years. Unlike the sprawling gait of most reptiles, early dinosaurs had already evolved an upright posture, legs positioned directly beneath the body rather than out to the sides, which allowed for more efficient movement and considerably less energy spent simply staying upright while walking. Many also possessed an early version of the remarkably efficient respiratory system still found in birds today. One that moves air through the lungs in a continuous one-way flow, rather than the in and out breathing most animals rely on, extracting oxygen far more effectively, particularly valuable. In a world where atmospheric oxygen levels during parts of this era were actually lower than they are today. These were not adaptations built in response to the Carnian crisis. They were advantages that had simply been sitting there unused and largely irrelevant until the right circumstances finally made them decisive. One final crisis sealed what the Carnian pluvial episode had begun, at the very end of the Triassic period roughly 201 million years ago, another wave of severe volcanic activity. This time associated with the breakup of Pangaea itself, triggered yet another major extinction event, eliminating most of the remaining large competitors that had managed to survive up to that point. When the dust settled, the dinosaurs did not merely survive this final bottleneck. They inherited what remained of the world almost entirely uncontested. It had taken roughly 50 million years, 3 separate global crises, and a considerable amount of what can only honestly be described as evolutionary chance. But by the early Jurassic period, the world we described earlier, the one of towering herbivores, feathered pack hunters and giants patrolling ancient floodplains, had finally decisively begun. There is something worth pausing on here, something that connects quietly back to the small hidden creature we met at the very beginning of this story. The synapsid lineage that so nearly inherited the post-Permian world, the one that lost its opportunity to the dinosaurs across those repeated crises, did not simply disappear. It persisted quietly in ever smaller and more marginal forms for the entire span of the age that followed. It shrank, adapted, learned to live in the margins of a world it once might have ruled, and it continued generation after generation for well over 150 million years, waiting without any awareness that it was waiting for circumstances to shift again. That lineage is our own. Every mammal alive today, ourselves included, descends directly from the losing side of this ancient contest, a lineage that spent an almost unimaginable stretch of deep time surviving in the shadow of the very animals who took the world away from us the first time around. It is a strange thing to realize and worth sitting with quietly before we move forward. The rise of the dinosaurs and the long patient survival of our own distant ancestors are not two separate stories. They are the same story told from opposite sides of the same set of crises, and the second half of that story, the half where the balance finally tips back, is still tens of millions of years away from beginning. For now in the world we are about to step further into, the dinosaurs are not simply present. They are ascending, and what they build over the tens of millions of years that follow will be more varied, more strange, and considerably more astonishing than even this chapter has managed to suggest. There comes a point in every dominant era where its scale becomes almost difficult to describe honestly without sounding as though you are exaggerating, and the world dinosaurs had built by the late Jurassic and into the Cretaceous is exactly that kind of world. This is not the story of a single successful group of animals anymore. This is the story of an empire spread across every continent, filling nearly every possible way of being alive on land, and it is worth taking the time to actually walk through what that empire looked like at its fullest extent before we return to the smaller, quieter creatures still waiting patiently in its shadow. Begin with size itself, because size is where this era still manages to surprise even people who think they already know the basics. The largest landy animals ever to walk the earth were not the tyrannosaurs most people picture first. They were the long-necked, long-tailed herbivores known as sauropods, and some of them reached dimensions that remain difficult to fully process even with a complete skeleton laid out in front of you. A creature called Argentinosaurus, discovered in Argentina and known mostly from a handful of enormous vertebrae and limb bones, is estimated by some researchers to have weighed somewhere between 70 and 100 tons, roughly the weight of 10 or more adult elephants standing together, and to have stretched somewhere close to 35 meters from head to tail. The honest truth is that we do not know its exact size with certainty, because no complete skeleton of this animal has ever been found, and estimates for creatures known from partial remains like this one can vary considerably depending on which bones survived and how researchers choose to scale the rest of the body from them. What we do know from the bones that do exist is that an animal of roughly this scale did walk this earth-breathing air, warming itself in the sun, and requiring an almost unimaginable quantity of plant matter every single day simply to stay alive. That last detail matters more than it might seem, because feeding an animal that large is its own kind of quiet miracle, one that reshaped entire ecosystems around it. A sauropod of this size likely needed to consume several hundred pounds of vegetation daily, and to make that possible, its entire digestive system worked differently than almost anything alive today. Rather than chewing food thoroughly the way mammals do, many sauropods appear to have swallowed plant matter largely whole, sometimes aided by swallowed stones called gastroliths that helped grind vegetation down inside a massive gut, allowing the animal to spend more of its limited time simply gathering food rather than slowly processing it. Their long necks, meanwhile, may have allowed them to graze across an enormous vertical and horizontal range without needing to move their entire massive body, very often conserving energy in a way that made their extraordinary size not just possible but generally efficient. Scholars continue to debate exactly how these necks were held and used in life, whether raised high to browse treetops or swept low and wide across the ground like an enormous grazing arm. And the truth is that soft tissue simply does not fossilize well enough to settle the question definitively either way. Alongside these gentle giants moved predators built along an entirely different philosophy, and here the record offers one of its more genuinely startling revelations. For most of the 20th century, popular imagination pictured large predatory dinosaurs as solitary, scaly monsters, something closer to an oversized lizard than anything resembling a modern animal. Fossil discoveries over the past few decades have quietly dismantled that picture almost entirely. We now know that many predatory dinosaurs, including juvenile and even some adult tyrannosaurs, carried simple feather-like structures not for flight but likely for insulation, display, or both. Trackway evidence, meaning fossilized footprints preserved in ancient mud, has also revealed something remarkable. Multiple large predators moving together across the same ground at the same time, suggesting at least some pack-like or behavior among animals long imagined as solitary hunters. This does not mean every large predator hunted in coordinated groups the way wolves do today. The evidence remains genuinely limited, and paleontologists caution against assuming too much from a handful of trackway sites. But it does mean the confident, simple picture many of us grew up with apex predator, a solitary killing machine, was likely wrong, or at least badly incomplete for at least some of these animals. What made this level of ecological richness possible across every continent for tens of millions of years comes down to something easy to overlook: an atmosphere and climate profoundly different from our own. Global temperatures during much of the Jurassic and Cretaceous ran considerably warmer than today, with no polar ice caps at all for most of this era, and forests of ferns, cycads, and eventually flowering plants extending into latitudes that are frozen tundra now. This warmth did something else worth pausing on. It meant that even regions we would now consider extreme, close to the poles, experiencing months of near total darkness. Each winter supported dinosaur populations that appear to have lived there year-round, rather than migrating away from the cold and dark fossil beds in what is now northern Alaska and southern Australia, both far closer to their respective poles during this era than most people expect, have produced dinosaur remains showing signs of adaptation to genuinely difficult seasonal conditions, larger eyes in some species possibly to gather what little light existed during polar winters, and bone growth patterns suggesting some of these animals endured real seasonal hardship rather than simply escaping it. It raises a quiet, honestly unresolved question that paleontologists are still working through. Were these polar dinosaurs full-time residents, or seasonal visitors who happened to leave remains behind before retreating toward warmer ground? The bone evidence leans toward year-round residency for at least some species, but it does not settle the matter completely. And it was not only the land that this empire touched. By the middle of the Cretaceous, dinosaurs themselves had already begun taking to the air in a form we do not always think to associate with them. Birds, as we discussed earlier, are dinosaurs in the most literal biological sense, and by this point in the story, true, birds already existed alongside their larger flightless relatives, filling ecological niches that still exist today, wading through shallow water, nesting along cliffs, hunting insects through dense undergrowth. It is worth pausing on how strange and how quietly moving that overlap really is. The tyrannosaur stalking a floodplain and the small feathered bird darting through the canopy above her were, in a very real evolutionary sense, closer relatives to each other than either was to certain other animals in that same forest. Is it any wonder, given all of this, that nothing alive at the time seemed capable of imagining an end to it? An empire this vast, this adaptable, this deeply woven into every layer of land, sea and sky does not read from the inside like something fragile. It reads like permanence, and in fairness to every creature living through it, there was no reasonable way for any of them to know otherwise. Dominance on this scale had never been seriously challenged in 150 million years. Why would this particular stretch of time be any different from the 100 million years that came before it? And yet somewhere beneath the surface of this seemingly permanent world, forces were already quietly stirring that none of these magnificent creatures had any way of sensing forces that had nothing to do with predators or prey, nothing to do with strength or size, and everything to do with something far larger than any single animal, however enormous, could ever hope to withstand. Not every ending announces itself with a single dramatic moment. Some endings begin quietly years or even centuries before anyone alive would think to call them an ending at all, and the story we are about to step into belongs firmly to that second category. Because before there was ever a flash of light over the Yucatan Peninsula, before the sky itself seemed to catch fire, something else had already begun stirring on the other side of the world, slowly, patiently, and almost entirely unnoticed by anything living through it. Halfway around the globe from the great floodplains we have spent the last several parts exploring on the landmass that will one day become India. The ground itself was beginning to behave strangely. Deep beneath the surface, a vast reservoir of molten rock was pushing upward and over, a period that may have stretched across several 100,000 years. It began finding its way to the surface in a series of eruptions, unlike anything most of us picture when we hear the word volcano. This was not a single dramatic mountain exploding in one violent afternoon. This was something slower, larger, and in its own way considerably stranger, a series of eruptions so vast that lava did not simply flow from a single opening but poured out across enormous stretches of land in successive sheets, layer after layer, each one hardening before the next arrived on top of it. Geologists today call the result the Deccan Traps, and if you were to fly over central India now, you would see the evidence of this ancient event stacked in visible layers along cliff faces and river valleys, each layer a separate eruption, each one representing thousands of years of the earth, quietly, relentlessly reshaping itself from below. To understand just how strange this was, it helps to know that the total volume of material that emerged from the Deccan Traps over this period may have been enough to cover an area roughly the size of France under lava a mile deep in places. Some individual eruptions within this sequence may have released more lava in a single event than any volcanic eruption witnessed by humans in recorded history by a considerable margin. And critically, it was not primarily the lava itself that mattered for the wider world. It was what came up alongside it. Volcanic eruptions on this scale release enormous quantities of gas into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide chief among them. And when released gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, these gases do something subtle but genuinely consequential to a planet's climate. Sulfur dioxide in large enough quantities can reflect sunlight away from the Earth's surface, cooling the planet for years or even decades at a time after a major eruptive pulse. Carbon dioxide released in parallel does something closer to the opposite, trapping heat and gradually warming the planet over longer stretches of time. The result across the final several 100,000 years of the Cretaceous appears to have been a climate lurching unpredictably between these two pressures, cooling sharply after intense eruptive pulses, then warming again as the gases dispersed and new eruptions had not yet begun over and over in a rhythm no ecosystem on Earth had ever needed to endure before. It's worth pausing here on something that rarely makes it into popular retellings of this story because it complicates the tidy narrative most people carry around without realizing it. For decades, the assumption outside specialist circles was simple. An asteroid struck the Earth and the dinosaurs died. Full stop, one cause, one effect, one afternoon. The actual scientific picture, the one that has slowly emerged from decades of careful, often disputed research, is considerably less tidy than that and considerably more honest about how endings of this magnitude actually tend to unfold. Because here is the genuinely uncertain part, the question that paleontologists and geologists have argued over for years without fully resolving. Were the Deccan traps already weakening this world significantly before anything ever struck it? Or were they a serious but survivable stressor, one that ecosystems were adapting to reasonably well until something else arrived and made recovery impossible? The honest answer is that both positions remain seriously defended within the scientific literature, and the evidence frustratingly does not point in only one direction. Some fossil records from this exact window of time show signs of real ecological strain shifts in plant diversity, changes in the isotopic signatures preserved in ancient shells that suggest ocean chemistry was already under measurable pressure. Other fossil beds from the same general period show remarkably little disruption at all, dinosaur diversity apparently holding steady right up until the very end. It is entirely possible that different regions of the planet were experiencing this slow-building crisis very differently, some already faltering, others still largely untouched, which would help explain why the fossil evidence itself seems to disagree with itself, depending on where in the world you happen to be looking. What almost nobody was equipped to notice, of course, is that a stress like this rarely announces itself as a stress at all. Not to the animals actually living through it. A tyrannosaur navigating a slightly cooler decade than her grandmother knew, or a herd of triceratops adjusting gradually to shifting plant life along a floodplain that had fed their ancestors for generations, would have had no framework for understanding what was actually happening beneath their feet, half a world away, in a landscape none of them would ever see. Change on this scale, spread out across hundreds of thousands of years, is close to invisible from the inside. It only becomes visible in hindsight millions of years later, to researchers piecing together isotopic records and ash layers in laboratories these animals could never have imagined. There is something quietly humbling in that. How much of what eventually reshapes a world, any world, is already underway long before anyone living through it has any reason to suspect it? There is a strange and largely unresolved wrinkle to this part of the story as well, one that has generated genuine, occasionally sharp disagreement among researchers over the past 2 decades. Some geological evidence suggests that the pace and intensity of Deccan Traps eruptions appear to shift noticeably right around the same window of time as the event we are building toward in the parts ahead, almost as though something disturbed the volcanic activity itself. A handful of researchers have proposed cautiously and with considerable ongoing debate that the shockwaves from a sufficiently massive impact elsewhere on the planet could theoretically have travelled through the Earth's crust and mantle with enough force to intensify volcanic activity already underway on the opposite side of the globe. This idea remains genuinely contested, and plenty of geologists remain skeptical that an impact, however large, could meaningfully influence volcanism happening on almost the exact opposite side of an entire planet. But the timing alone close enough to raise the question, seriously close enough that serious scientists keep returning to it in published research, rather than dismissing it outright, tells you something about how strange and interconnected this particular chapter of Earth's history may actually have been. Two of the largest natural forces this planet is capable of producing, a volcanic outpouring vast enough to reshape a subcontinent and something else still waiting for us further ahead in this story, may not have been entirely separate events after all. They may have been in ways we are still working to fully understand, quietly entangled with one another. None of this, it is worth saying clearly, means the world was already doomed, or that everything which happened next was simply inevitable. Ecosystems are remarkably resilient things, and this one had already weathered climate shifts, sea level changes, and volcanic episodes across its long history without collapsing. The Deccan traps alone, most researchers now agree, were unlikely to have been enough on their own to end an empire that had lasted 150 million years. What they appear to have done instead is something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. They appear to have left this world leaner than it otherwise would have been, its margins narrower, its capacity to absorb one more major shock somewhat diminished, without a single animal alive at the time having any way to sense that the ground beneath their permanence had grown even slightly less certain than it used to be. And so the world moves forward, still full, still magnificent, still entirely unaware of anything unusual happening to it, the way most worlds are right up until the moment they are not. Somewhere in the skies above this same Earth, at this very stretch of time, something else has already begun its long, silent journey, entirely indifferent to volcanic eruptions, to tyrannosaurs, to triceratops, herds grazing along ancient rivers, following a path that has nothing at all to do with anything happening on the ground below it and everything to do with what is about to happen next. Somewhere above the Earth, entirely indifferent to volcanoes, tyrannosaurs, or the slow accumulation of stress, we just spent time understanding a piece of rock roughly the width of a small city has been travelling through the solar system for longer than any land animal on the planet below has been alive. It began its journey in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, dislodged from a larger body by some collision so far in the past that no one will ever know its exact date, and for millions of years afterward it simply drifted following an orbit that purely by chance happened to intersect with a small blue life-covered world at exactly this moment in its long uneventful existence. There is something worth sitting with in that word chance before we go any further, because it is easy telling this story after the fact to make it sound inevitable, as though the Earth and this piece of rock were always destined to meet. They were not. Space is staggeringly empty, and the overwhelming majority of objects like this one pass through the solar system without ever coming close to any planet at all. What happened on this particular day was not fate. It was the outcome of an almost incomprehensibly long sequence of gravitational nudges and orbital coincidences, stretching back millions of years, that simply happened on this one afternoon to align in exactly the wrong way for everything living on the surface below. The object itself, which scientists studying it today believe measured somewhere between 10 and 15 kilometers across, roughly the size of a small mountain, entered the atmosphere at a speed that is genuinely difficult to translate into anything intuitive. Travelling at something in the range of 20 kilometers every second, it crossed the distance from the upper atmosphere to the surface of the Earth in a matter of seconds, far too quickly for friction with the air to slow it in any meaningful way, far too quickly for anything living below to register what was approaching before it arrived. It struck the shallow coastal waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in present-day Mexico, in a location that geologists would not identify with confidence for another 66 million years buried, as it eventually became beneath layers of limestone and sediment. What happened in the seconds immediately following impact is even now something scientists reconstruct largely through modelling rather than direct observation, since nothing that witnessed it up close survived to leave any record beyond the rock itself. The energy released in that instant, according to most current estimates, was roughly equivalent to several billion times the force of the atomic weapons used at the end of the Second World War, concentrated into a single point on the Earth's surface rather than spread across a city. A crater began forming almost instantly, eventually stretching more than 150 kilometers across and reaching depths of over 20 kilometers before the surrounding rock, still molten in places, began to rebound and partially refill it, leaving behind the structure that geologists today call the Chicxulub crater, named for a small town near its center that has no way of knowing it sits atop one of the most significant sites in the entire history of life on Earth. The immediate physical effects radiated outward from that point with a speed and violence that is worth describing, honestly though gently, because understanding what actually happened here is part of understanding everything that follows in this story. Within a radius of well over 1,000 kilometers, the shockwave from the impact would have leveled forests, flattened terrain, and likely killed outright through blast force alone. Most large animals unfortunate enough to be caught within that range, because the impact occurred in shallow coastal water rather than on open land. It also displaced an enormous volume of seawater, almost instantly generating tsunamis that current modelling suggests may have reached heights approaching 100 meters near the point of impact itself, waves that swept inland across coastal lowlands for considerable distances before finally losing their force. Sediment layers found today in locations bordering the ancient Gulf of Mexico, in places as far away as what is now the southern United States, show clear evidence of exactly this kind of sudden violent inundation, sand and marine debris deposited far inland in a single catastrophic event, precisely where geological modelling predicted such evidence should exist. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people, one rarely discussed outside specialist literature, because it reveals something about why this particular impact proved so uniquely devastating rather than simply catastrophic in a more contained, survivable way. The location of the strike mattered enormously, arguably as much as the size of the object itself. The rock beneath the Yucatan Peninsula at the time of impact happened to be unusually rich in sulfur-bearing minerals, deposited there over millions of years as ancient seabed sediment. When the asteroid struck, it did not simply displace rock and water. It vaporized enormous quantities of that sulfur-rich material, instantly launching it high into the atmosphere alongside pulverized rock and dust. Researchers who have modeled impacts of similar size striking other locations on Earth, granite bedrock rather than sulfur-rich limestone for instance, have found that the resulting climate disruption in those alternate scenarios would likely have been considerably less severe, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable, honestly speculative question that a number of paleontologists have quietly entertained in published research. Had this same object struck almost anywhere else on the planet, a slightly different point along its orbital path, a difference of moments rather than millions of years, would the outcome for life on Earth have been meaningfully less catastrophic? No one can answer that question with certainty. It remains and will likely always remain one of the more haunting uncertainties in this entire story. The idea that the sheer scale of what followed may have depended not only on the size of the object involved, but on the particular composition of the ground it happened to strike. Beyond the blast, beyond the tsunamis, something else began almost immediately that would prove in the end far more consequential to the fate of the dinosaurs than the initial impact itself. The debris thrown into the atmosphere, pulverized rock, vaporized sulfur ash from the wildfires that ignited across enormous stretches of scorched forest in the hours and days that followed, began spreading rapidly around the entire planet, carried by high-altitude winds into a layer that would soon block sunlight from reaching the surface across the globe. Not just near the impact site, but everywhere, from the Yucatan to the Arctic to the far side of the Earth, that had not even felt the shockwave. It's worth pausing here gently before we go further, because this is the point in the story where the scale of what happened stops being about a single afternoon and starts becoming about something that would unfold over months and years, a slower and in some ways more difficult chapter than the initial strike itself. The small mammal we met curled in her burrow back at the very beginning of this story has by this point likely survived the bust wave and the initial fires simply by virtue of being far enough away and small enough to shelter underground. But the world she will emerge into whenever she finally does is not going to be the world she left behind. It is going to be darker, colder and quieter than anything her lineage has ever had to endure, and what happens to her and to every other surviving creature across the following months is where this story turns from a single catastrophic event into something closer to a long, difficult test of endurance, one that the vast majority of species alive on that particular afternoon would ultimately fail. There is a particular kind of darkness that most of us will never experience, one that has nothing to do with night, because night still promises a sunrise a few hours later, something the sky over Earth would not reliably offer again for what may have been well over a year. This is the part of the story we have been moving steadily toward, the part where the initial violence of impact gives way to something slower, quieter, and in many ways far more difficult for anything alive to endure. Within days of the strike, the debris thrown into the upper atmosphere had spread far enough to encircle the entire planet, and the sunlight reaching the surface began to dim in a way nothing living had ever experienced. Current climate modelling of this event suggests that in the weeks following impact, the amount of sunlight reaching the ground may have dropped by as much as 90% or more in some regions, plunging what had been warm, sunlit forests into something closer to permanent twilight. Plants which depend on sunlight in the most fundamental biological sense began failing almost immediately. Photosynthesis, the quiet chemical process. Every green leaf on Earth performs constantly without any creature ever needing to think about it, simply could not continue at anything close to a normal rate. Within weeks, and in some regions within days, entire forests that had stood for centuries began to die from the base of the food chain upward, not from fire, not from blast damage, but from an absence of light so severe and so prolonged that the plants themselves could no longer sustain their own basic chemistry. It is worth pausing here gently to understand why this particular consequence, quiet, invisible, entirely bloodless, proved to be the single most devastating part of the entire event. A blast wave kills quickly and locally, a collapsing food chain kills slowly and everywhere, and it is almost impossible to overstate how completely that collapse would have unfolded. Insects that depended on living plant matter began starving within weeks. The small creatures that depended on those insects began starving not long after, and the larger animals, the herbivorous dinosaurs whose enormous bodies required enormous quantities of food every single day simply to maintain their own weight, found themselves facing an impossible arithmetic, almost immediately vast bodies demanding vast fuel in a world that had within a matter of weeks stopped reliably producing any. One detail from the fossil and geochemical record deserves particular attention here because it rarely makes it into popular retellings of this story, and it reveals something genuinely surprising about which animals actually had the best chance of surviving what followed. It was not primarily the largest or the strongest creatures who fared best in the months after impact. It was overwhelmingly animals that required very little food to begin with, animals that could survive for extended periods on almost nothing at all. Researchers studying the fossil record across this boundary have found that body size alone was a remarkably strong predictor of survival, Not because size offered any protection from the initial blast, but because a smaller body with lower metabolic demands could simply endure far longer on dramatically reduced food availability than a larger one ever could. This is part of why the small, burrowing mammal we met at the very beginning of this story had a real measurable advantage in the months that followed. An advantage that had nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with adaptability in any conscious sense, and everything to do with the simple and glamorous fact that her body needed so little to keep functioning. The oceans, meanwhile, were enduring a version of this same collapse playing out along an entirely different set of mechanisms. And it is worth understanding what happened there as well, because the devastation beneath the waves was in its own way just as severe as anything happening on land. Microscopic marine plankton. The base of nearly the entire oceanic food chain depend on sunlight in exactly the same way land plants do, and as light levels fell across the surface of the sea, plankton populations appear to have collapsed with startling speed. Geochemical evidence preserved in ocean sediment from this exact window of time shows a sudden dramatic drop in the biological productivity of the upper ocean, a signature scientists sometimes refer to with a bluntness that feels appropriate here as the Strangelove Ocean, a period during which the sea for a time appears to have gone almost entirely biologically quiet. Ammonites, a group of shelled marine creatures that had thrived in Earth's oceans for well over 300 million years. Surviving multiple previous mass extinctions along the way, finally disappeared entirely during this window, unable to withstand a collapse of this particular kind after having weathered so many others before it. The great marine reptiles we discussed earlier, the mosasaurs patrolling the shallow seas of the Cretaceous, vanished as well, their entire food chain, from plankton up through fish up through themselves, having been effectively severed near its base within a matter of months. How long did this darkened, collapsing world actually last? This is one of the genuinely contested details within the scientific literature, and it is worth being honest about the uncertainty rather than smoothing it over for the sake of a tidier story. Early models of this event developed decades ago suggested the most severe darkness might have lasted only a matter of months before sunlight began returning to something closer to normal levels. More recent research, incorporating a fuller understanding of exactly how much fine soot and dust the global wildfires ignited by the impact would have injected into the upper atmosphere, has pushed that estimate considerably longer, with some current models suggesting severely reduced sunlight may have persisted for 1 to 2 years before the atmosphere finally began to clear. The honest answer is that researchers do not yet agree on the precise duration, and the true figure likely varied considerably by region, some areas clearing sooner, others remaining darkened and cold for longer, depending on wind patterns, latitude, and local atmospheric conditions that are difficult to reconstruct with full confidence 66 million years after the fact. What we do know with considerably more confidence is what this extended darkness did to global temperatures, and the picture that emerges is a genuinely brutal one. Though it is worth saying again gently that brutal here describes the history itself, not the way we are choosing to sit with it together tonight. With sunlight reaching the surface so severely diminished, global average temperatures appear to have dropped sharply in the months following impact, potentially by 10 degrees or more in some regions, transforming what had been a warm, ice-free Cretaceous world into something approaching a sudden, artificial winter, regardless of the actual season underway when it began. Forests already weakened by darkness now faced freezing temperatures many had never evolved any capacity to endure. Cold-blooded animals, reptiles, and amphibians whose body temperature depended directly on their surrounding environment found themselves suddenly unable to generate enough internal warmth to remain active, let alone hunt or forage across enormous stretches of the planet that had only months earlier never experienced anything resembling frost. It is worth taking a moment here quietly to consider what this actually meant for the animals still alive at this point in the story. The ones who had survived the initial blast, the tsunamis, the wildfires, only to find themselves facing something slower and in some ways crueler, a world offering less food with every passing week growing, colder with every passing month and giving no indication of when or whether conditions might ever improve. There was no way for any surviving creature to know this darkness was temporary. There was no way to know that sunlight would eventually return, that forest would eventually regrow, that the Strangelove Ocean would eventually stir back to life. Every animal enduring this period was doing so blind one day at a time, with no larger understanding available to it, simply persisting because persisting was the only thing left to do. Is it any wonder, given everything we've just walked through together, that so few of the largest animals made it through to the other side of this Tyrannosaur? However powerful, however dominant she had been only months earlier, could not simply wait out a food shortage measured in years the way a small burrowing mammal could. Her body demanded too much, too consistently in a world that had almost overnight stopped being able to provide it. One by one across those difficult months, the great dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, the sauropods, the tyrannosaurs, the triceratops herds that had grazed these floodplains for millions of years began to disappear, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, quietly, as the slow arithmetic of starvation finally caught up with even the most successful animals this planet had ever produced. And somewhere beneath the frozen, darkened ground, in a burrow dug deep enough to offer at least some shelter from the worst of the cold above, a small heartbeat continues slower than it once was, conserving what little energy remains, waiting without any understanding of what it is waiting for a change that has not yet come, but that is at long last finally beginning to. For a very long time nobody knew any of this happened, not really, not in the way we've just spent the last several parts describing. What we understand now, the darkened skies, the collapsing food chains, the frozen months that followed, is not something anyone simply guessed at and happened to get right. It is the product of one of the more remarkable detective stories in the history of science, one that unfolded slowly across continents and decades, built almost entirely from clues so small and so easy to overlook that it is genuinely surprising anyone ever noticed them at all. The story of how we came to understand this event properly begins not with a dinosaur bone, but with a thin, unremarkable-looking layer of clay, barely a few centimeters thick, in most places found sandwiched between older rock containing dinosaur fossils and younger rock containing none at all. Geologists had known about this layer for a long time before anyone understood what it meant encountering it in rock formations scattered across the world from Italy to Denmark to New Zealand, always in roughly the same geological position, always marking the same abrupt transition. For most of the 20th century it was treated as a curiosity, a strange but not especially meaningful marker in the rock record. That changed in the late 1970s through the work of a father and son research team whose collaboration would end up reshaping an entire field of science. Luis Alvarez, a physicist who had already built a substantial career studying particle physics, and his son Walter, a geologist working on rock formations in Italy, became curious about that same thin clay layer, encountering it firsthand in a limestone gorge near the town of Gubbio. Rather than treating it as simply a boundary marker, they began asking a more specific question. One nobody had seriously pursued before. How long had this layer actually taken to form? To answer it, they turned to an unusual method borrowed from nuclear physics, measuring the concentration of a rare element called iridium within the clay itself. Iridium is exceptionally scarce in the Earth's crust, having largely sunk toward the planet's core during its formation billions of years ago. But it arrives on the surface at a slow, fairly predictable rate from the steady rain of cosmic dust that falls onto every planet in the solar system Earth, included continuously and almost imperceptibly. By measuring how much iridium had accumulated within the clay layer, the Alvarez team hoped to calculate roughly how many thousands of years it represented. What they found instead startled them considerably. The iridium concentration within that thin clay layer was not simply elevated. It was measured at levels roughly 30 times higher than anything found in the rock immediately above or below it, a concentration far too extreme to be explained by ordinary cosmic dust accumulating gradually over any plausible span of time. There was, in short, far too much iridium in that layer for it to have arrived slowly. Something had delivered it suddenly, all at once, and the only mechanism the team could identify capable of depositing that much of an otherwise rare element in a single geological instant was the impact of a large asteroid or comet, an object whose composition, unlike the Earth's crust, had never undergone the same billions of years of internal separation and so still carried iridium in far greater abundance. When the Alvarez team published this finding in 1980, it did not arrive to universal acceptance, and it is worth being honest about that, because the story of this discovery is not simply one of brilliant insight instantly recognized. Many paleontologists at the time, having spent entire careers studying the gradual patterns of dinosaur diversity and decline across millions of years of fossil evidence, were deeply skeptical of an explanation that seemed to reduce one of the most significant events in the history of life to a single sudden afternoon. The proposal was met in some corners of the scientific community with real resistance, even scorn, and for close to a decade afterward, the asteroid hypothesis remained a genuinely contested idea, rather than an accepted fact missing one crucial piece of evidence that critics repeatedly and reasonably pointed to. If an impact of this scale had actually occurred, where precisely was the crater it must have left behind? That missing piece would not surface for another 11 years, and it emerged almost by accident from research that had originally been conducted for an entirely different purpose. In the late 1970s, around the same time the Alvarez team was analysing clay in Italy, geophysicists working for a Mexican oil company had been quietly mapping unusual gravitational and magnetic anomalies beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, data collected in the ordinary course of searching for potential petroleum deposits. The data showed something strange, a vast, roughly circular formation buried deep beneath the surface, but its significance went almost entirely unrecognized for years, filed away in company records that few outside the oil industry ever had reason to examine. It was only in 1991, after a graduate student researching Caribbean geology came across scattered references to this old survey data and connected it with a spark of recognition to the ongoing debate about the missing impact crater, that the pieces finally came together. Subsequent analysis confirmed it. The buried structure beneath the Yucatan Peninsula was indeed an impact crater, and its estimated age, determined independently through multiple dating methods applied to rock samples recovered from the site, matched the boundary layer the Alvarez team had studied more than a decade earlier almost precisely. It is worth sitting with how strange and quietly moving that convergence actually is. Two entirely separate lines of evidence. One, a thin layer of unusually iridium-rich clay studied by a physicist and his geologist son in an Italian gorge. The other, a buried geological anomaly, first noticed by oil surveyors searching for something else entirely in Mexico, arrived independently, and without any coordination between them at the exact same conclusion, the exact same moment in time. Science does not often offer confirmations this clean, and when it does, it tends to change a field permanently. Within a few years of the crater's confirmation, the scientific consensus around this event shifted decisively, and what had been a contested, occasionally mocked hypothesis became and remains today the dominant scientific explanation for what triggered the end of the age of dinosaurs. None of this means every question has been fully answered, and it is worth being honest about that as well, because good science rarely closes every door completely. Researchers continue to debate finer details, exactly how quickly the extinction unfolded once the initial darkness set in, exactly how much the Deccan Traps volcanism we discussed earlier contributed alongside the impact, exactly why certain groups of animals, crocodilians among them, managed to survive this event nearly unchanged, while so many of their contemporaries did not. The broad outline of the story: an asteroid. A sudden and catastrophic darkening, a slow collapse of the global food chain, is about as settled as anything in paleontology gets. The finer texture of exactly how it all unfolded, region by the region, month by month, remains an active and genuinely unresolved area of ongoing research, one that new fossil discoveries continue to reshape even now. 66 million years after the fact, there is something quietly remarkable in realizing that all of this, the crater, the clay layer, the iridium, the decades of careful argument between skeptical scientists had undiscovered and unrecognized for so long, waiting patiently in the rock for someone curious enough and stubborn enough to finally notice what it had been saying all along. And there is more still waiting to be understood, because even after the crater was found, even after the consensus shifted, a quieter argument continued within the scientific community itself, one that would take considerably longer to settle. And that reveals something honest and human about how science actually works. When even careful, well-intentioned researchers look at the same evidence and arrive at genuinely different conclusions. Science, it turns out, rarely settles into a single unanimous voice, even when the broad outline of an event has been accepted for decades, and the story of what actually killed the dinosaurs offers a particularly good example of just how much genuine, occasionally heated disagreement can persist beneath a consensus that looks from the outside entirely settled. The most enduring of these disagreements concerns something we touched on earlier without fully resolving it: the relationship between the asteroid impact and the Deccan Traps volcanism unfolding on the opposite side of the planet. For most working paleontologists today, the impact is understood as the primary trigger of the extinction, the volcanism a serious but secondary contributing stressor. This is not, however, a view held universally, and the researcher most associated with challenging it, a paleontologist named Gerta Keller, has spent much of her career arguing for a substantially different interpretation, one that places the Deccan Traps at the center of the story rather than at its margins. Her research, conducted largely on rock sequences in Mexico and India, has led her to argue that the most intense pulse of Deccan volcanism occurred remarkably close in time to the impact itself, close enough that she contends the two events cannot be neatly separated, and that volcanic activity may have already pushed many ecosystems to the brink of collapse before the asteroid ever struck, with the impact serving less as the sole cause and more as a final decisive blow against a world already severely weakened. This is not a fringe position, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness it has earned within the field, even though it remains at present very much a minority view among paleontologists as a whole. Keller's critics, and there are many within the discipline, argue that the precise dating of volcanic pulses relative to the impact remains genuinely difficult to establish with the level of confidence her argument requires, and that the fossil record, when examined broadly across multiple sites worldwide rather than the specific sequences she has focused on, shows a pattern more consistent with the sudden impact-driven collapse than a slow volcanically driven decline. The disagreement has at times grown sharp enough to spill beyond the usual bounds of academic debate, with researchers on both sides occasionally accusing the other of selectively emphasizing evidence that supports their preferred conclusion. It is worth saying plainly, because it says something true and worth sitting with, about how science actually functions, that this argument has not been fully resolved even now, more than 4 decades after the Alvarez team first proposed the impact hypothesis. Most paleontologists remain confident the asteroid was the primary and decisive cause. A meaningful minority continue to argue the volcanism deserves considerably more credit or blame than it typically receives. Both groups are working from the same fossil record, the same rock layers, the same physical world, and have simply reached different conclusions about what that evidence honestly is telling them. There is a second quieter debate running alongside this one, less publicly contentious, but in some ways just as difficult to resolve, and it concerns a problem paleontologists call somewhat technically the Signor Lips effect. Here is the difficulty in plain terms. Fossilization is an extraordinarily rare event. Only a tiny fraction of any animal population that ever lived will ever be preserved as a fossil, and an even tinier fraction of those fossils will ever be found. This means that even if a particular species survived right up until the very final moment before the asteroid struck, the odds of finding a fossil from that species dated to that exact final layer of rock are statistically quite low, simply due to the rarity of fossilization itself, not because the species actually died out earlier. The practical result is that many dinosaur species appear in the fossil record to vanish somewhat earlier than the boundary itself, creating what looks like a gradual decline in the final few 100,000 years of the Cretaceous, even in scenarios where the actual extinction was genuinely sudden, untangling how much of the apparent pre-impact decline in dinosaur diversity is real, and how much is simply an illusion created by the statistical rarity of fossilization, remains a genuinely unresolved and actively researched question, one that different research teams, using different statistical methods on different fossil beds, continue to answer somewhat differently. Perhaps the most emotionally resonant of these open questions, though, and the one audiences tend to find most affecting when they first encounter it, concerns not the cause of the extinction, but its aftermath, specifically the question of why some lineages survived this catastrophe almost entirely intact while others seemingly quite similar in size. Habitat and diet were wiped out completely. Birds, as we have discussed, survived, but not all birds did, and the pattern of exactly which bird lineages made it through remains only partially understood. Recent research examining the skeletal structure of surviving versus extinct bird lineages from this period has suggested that ground-dwelling and ground-nesting birds may have fared meaningfully better than tree-dwelling species, plausibly because the collapse of global forests in the aftermath of impact would have devastated tree-dependent lineages first and most severely, while birds already adapted to foraging and nesting on the ground had somewhat more flexibility in a suddenly treeless world. This remains, it is worth saying honestly, a compelling hypothesis, rather than a fully settled conclusion supported by a growing body of evidence but not yet universally accepted across the field. Crocodilians present an even stranger puzzle, one that continues to genuinely surprise people when they first hear the details. Modern crocodiles and alligators are in evolutionary terms close cousins of the dinosaurs, both descending from the same archosaur lineage we discussed earlier in this story, and by most reasonable expectations a large, cold-blooded, food-demanding predator should have been exactly the kind of animal least equipped to survive a prolonged collapse in food availability and a sudden drop in global temperature. And yet crocodilians made it through this extinction with remarkably little disruption, while their much larger dinosaurian cousins did not. The leading explanation involves a genuine biological advantage tied to how crocodilians manage their own metabolism, an extraordinary tolerance for extended periods without food. Some modern crocodile species are capable of surviving well over a year between meals under the right conditions, combined with a semi-aquatic lifestyle that may have offered somewhat more stable access to whatever food sources remained available in rivers and wetlands, even as terrestrial ecosystems collapsed around them. It is a genuinely elegant explanation, and it fits the available evidence reasonably well, though researchers continue to debate exactly how much of the credit belongs to metabolic tolerance alone versus other less well understood factors specific to freshwater and coastal ecosystems during this period. Is it not a strange kind of comfort in a story built around such total loss to learn that survival here was rarely about strength or speed or dominance in the conventional sense. Time and again, across every group of animals we have examined, the deciding factor appears to have come down to something closer to patience, low metabolic demand, flexibility of habitat, the willingness and ability to simply endure a diminished world rather than attempt to dominate it. It is worth sitting with how thoroughly this inverts the story. Most of us grew up with the popular image of the dinosaurs as somehow too big, too specialized, too locked into their own success to adapt to a changing world, while their smaller, quieter contemporaries possessed some special evolutionary foresight the giants lacked. The actual picture emerging from decades of careful research is less a story of foresight and more a story of circumstance of which particular biological traits, developed for entirely unrelated reasons over millions of years, happened to prove useful when a catastrophe none of these animals could have anticipated finally arrived. None of these open questions, it is worth emphasizing, clearly undermine the broader picture this story has been building across the parts we have shared together so far. The asteroid struck, the world darkened. The vast majority of large land animals on Earth did not survive what followed. These facts are about as well established as anything in paleontology gets supported by multiple independent lines of evidence that have only grown stronger, not weaker, as research has continued. What remains genuinely open and what continues to occupy careful researchers even now are the finer questions beneath that broad outline: exactly how much the volcanism contributed, exactly which biological traits mattered most, exactly why certain lineages persisted while their closest relatives did not. Science, at its most honest, tends to look less like a book with its final chapter already written, and more like this: a broad and confident outline surrounding a genuinely uncertain, still actively debated interior refined patiently, one careful study at a time by researchers willing to keep questioning even the conclusions their own field has already largely accepted. And with the broad shape of the disaster now understood and its finer edges still being carefully argued over in journals and conferences around the world, even today there remains one more part of this story still waiting to be told, the part concerned not with how this world ended, but with what was actually left standing in the silence afterward and what that emptiness would eventually make possible. Silence, it turns out, has its own particular texture, and the silence that settled over the Earth in the years immediately following impact was unlike anything the planet had produced in the entire history of complex life up to that point. To walk through this world, had anyone been able to, would have meant walking through landscapes stripped of the sounds that had defined them for 150 million years. No distant bellow of a sauropod herd moving through a floodplain. No crash of a predator through underbrush, no chorus of small reptiles calling across a warm evening. What replaced it was something closer to stillness, broken only by wind moving through the skeletal remains of forests that had not yet begun to regrow. The scale of what had actually been lost is worth stating plainly, because it is easy, after spending so much time with the mechanics of the disaster itself, to lose sight of the sheer magnitude of the outcome. Current estimates place the overall loss of species somewhere in the range of 75% of all life on Earth. A figure that becomes almost impossible to hold in the mind fully once you begin to consider what it actually meant in practice. Every non-avian dinosaur, every single species among the thousands that had filled every forest, floodplain and coastline across every continent was gone. The great marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs that had ruled the shallow seas were gone as well. The flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, whose massive wingspans had once cast shadows over Cretaceous coastlines, vanished, entirely leaving the skies for the first time in tens of millions of years, without any large flying vertebrate at all. Even the ammonites, that lineage of shelled marine creatures that had persisted through multiple previous mass extinctions across more than 300 million years of Earth's history, finally succumbed in this one. It is worth pausing on that particular loss because it says something important about the nature of what actually happened here. This was not simply a bad period that a resilient world eventually absorbed the way it had absorbed crises before. This was an extinction severe enough and strange enough in its particular mechanisms to finally overwhelm lineages that had already proven themselves capable of surviving nearly everything else the planet had thrown at them across an almost unfathomable span of deep time. And yet for all of that loss, this was not in any meaningful sense an empty world. This is a detail that deserves real emphasis, because it is often lost in retellings that focus so heavily on what disappeared that they forget to mention what remained. Roughly a quarter of all species on Earth did survive this event, and among the survivors were creatures who would prove over the millions of years that follow to matter enormously to everything that came after. Small mammals, the descendants of the very lineage we have followed since the opening of this story survived in meaningful numbers, their small size and modest food requirements having carried them through the worst of the collapse. Birds survived as well, at least the ground-dwelling lineages we discussed earlier, carrying the genetic and evolutionary legacy of the dinosaurs forward into a world their larger relatives would never see. Insects, remarkably resilient as a group despite the collapse of so much plant life around them, persisted in reduced but still substantial numbers, and in the freshwater rivers and coastal wetlands, crocodilians, turtles and amphibians held on their particular biological toolkit, proving unexpectedly well suited to a world that had become in almost every sense dramatically diminished. What these survivors actually inherited, though, deserves careful description because the word survival can make what happened next sound simpler and gentler than it actually was. The immediate post-impact world these animals found themselves in was not a blank slate waiting patiently to be filled. It was a genuinely difficult, ecologically impoverished landscape, and the process of that landscape becoming anything resembling a stable, functioning ecosystem again took far longer than most people assume when they first encounter this story. Fossil evidence from sites across North America, particularly a remarkably well-studied sequence of rock layers in what is now Colorado, allows researchers to track this recovery with genuine precision, and what that record shows is sobering in its own quiet way. In the immediate aftermath, plant diversity collapsed dramatically, with the pre-impact forests, rich in a wide variety of flowering plants, conifers and ferns, replaced almost entirely by a small number of hardy, fast-growing fern species plants that could establish themselves quickly in disturbed, nutrient-poor soil, without depending on the complex ecological relationships that more diverse forests require. Paleobotanists studying this period sometimes refer to it with a directness that feels earned as a fern spike, a stretch of geological time during which fern spores dominate the fossil record almost to the exclusion of everything else. Evidence of a world that had been reduced ecologically speaking to something close to its most basic possible configuration. It took by most current estimates somewhere in the range of 1 million years for anything resembling genuine forest diversity to return to this landscape, and considerably longer, likely closer to several million years for ecosystems to reach a level of structural complexity comparable to what had existed before the impact. This detail tends to surprise people more than almost any other in this entire story, because it runs so directly against the instinct to imagine recovery as something that happens within a few generations, a difficult period followed reasonably quickly by a return to normal. The actual timeline was almost incomprehensibly longer than that. A small mammal born 1,000 years after the impact would have lived her entire life in a world still ecologically simplified and impoverished compared to the one her ancestors had known, and so would her descendants. For hundreds of generations afterward, the landscape recovering not within any single lifetime but across a span of time so vast that no individual creature living through any part of it could have perceived the recovery happening at all. There is a genuinely uncertain question tucked inside this recovery timeline, one that paleontologists continue to investigate without full resolution. Did this slow-halting recovery proceed at roughly the same pace everywhere on Earth, or did some regions rebound considerably faster than others? The evidence currently available suggests real regional variation, with some sites showing signs of ecological stabilization within a few 100,000 years, while others, particularly those closer to the impact site itself, appear to have remained severely disrupted for considerably longer. Researchers studying sediment cores from the Gulf of Mexico, close to ground zero of the original impact, have found evidence suggesting that marine ecosystems in that immediate region took even longer to recover than the global average, plausibly, because the impact site itself had been so thoroughly and directly devastated that it represented, in effect, an even deeper hole to climb out of than less severely affected regions elsewhere on the planet. The precise reasons for this regional variation and the exact mechanisms that allowed some ecosystems to stabilize meaningfully faster than others remain an active area of ongoing research without full consensus yet achieved. What is worth sitting with gently as we move toward the final stretch of this story together is what this slow, difficult recovery actually meant for the small creatures who had survived the initial catastrophe. They did not emerge into safety. They emerged into a long, uncertain, and in many ways equally demanding. Chapter 1. Defined not by sudden violence but by scarcity, by ecosystems still finding their footing, by a world that offered considerably less than it once had and would continue offering considerably less for a very long time to come. Survival, in other words, was not the end of hardship. It was simply the beginning of a different, quieter kind of hardship, one measured not in the length of a single catastrophic year, but across the span of 1,000,000 years or more. Generation after generation of small, unremarkable animals simply persisting, without any awareness that persistence itself was slowly, almost imperceptibly building towards something none of them could have imagined. Because somewhere within that long, difficult recovery, something else was beginning to happen as well, something that had nothing to do with catastrophe and everything to do with opportunity. The world that had once offered no room above a certain size for any mammal. The invisible ceiling we discussed earlier in this story, a boundary pressed against for 150 million years and never once broken, had, in the space of a single catastrophic afternoon, simply ceased to exist. Whether anything would actually rise to fill that newly empty space, and what exactly that rise would eventually look like, is a story that unfolds slowly, tentatively, and with far less certainty or speed than popular imagination often assumes, and it is precisely that story, the long, uneven, genuinely surprising story of what mammals actually did with the opportunity finally placed in front of them, that we turn to next. If you were somehow able to visit the Earth exactly 100,000 years after the impact, expecting to find a world already reshaped by ambitious, rapidly diversifying mammals rushing to claim their new inheritance, you would honestly be disappointed. The actual pace of what happened next is one of the more quietly humbling aspects of this entire story, and it deserves to be understood clearly, because it corrects a version of events that has become almost folklore. The tidy idea that mammals were simply waiting for their moment and seized it the instant the dinosaurs disappeared. The truth, as the fossil record actually shows, it is considerably slower and considerably more uncertain than that. For the first several 100,000 years following the extinction, mammals did not explode into a wide array of large specialized forms. They remained for the most part small, generalized, and cautious in an evolutionary sense, occupying roughly the same modest ecological space they had occupied throughout the age of dinosaurs, simply doing so now without the constant pressure of enormous predators and competitors keeping them there. This hesitation, if it can even be called that, since evolution has no capacity for genuine hesitation in any conscious sense, likely reflects something important about how ecosystems actually recover from catastrophic disruption. Filling a newly emptied ecological role is not simply a matter of opportunity. It requires an entire supporting structure, stable plant communities, reliable food sources, complex relationships between predator and prey that had themselves been severely damaged and needed considerable time to stabilize before larger, more specialized animals could realistically be supported at all. Mammals could not become large herbivores, in other words, until the plant communities capable of feeding large herbivores had themselves recovered. And that recovery, as we discussed a little earlier in this story, was measured in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years, not in generations. What eventually broke this long-holding pattern is a genuinely fascinating chapter of the fossil record, one preserved with remarkable clarity in a series of sites across the Denver Basin in what is now Colorado, a location that has become, over the past several decades of careful excavation, one of the single most important windows researchers have into exactly how this recovery actually unfolded. Layer by layer, moving upward through several 100,000 years of accumulated sediment, paleontologists working this site have been able to track mammal body size increasing gradually and measurably over time. A slow but steady climb that appears to track closely alongside the parallel recovery of plant diversity in the very same rock layers. It is a remarkably direct piece of evidence for something that might otherwise remain purely theoretical physical proof embedded in stone. That the rise of mammals and the recovery of plant ecosystems were not two separate stories unfolding side by side, but a single deeply interconnected process, each one enabling and constraining the other in a slow, patient rhythm that took hundreds of thousands of years to fully play out. Roughly 600,000 years after the impact, something notable finally appears in this same fossil sequence, a mammal considerably larger than anything that had existed in the immediate aftermath, a creature that would have seemed almost unrecognizably large to any mammal alive in the shadow of the dinosaurs. This does not mean the ecological floodgates suddenly opened. Even at this point, these early large mammals remained modest by later standards, nothing approaching the genuine giants that would eventually emerge. But the barrier itself, that invisible ceiling pressed against for 150 million years and never once broken, had by this point been definitively and permanently shattered. And from here forward, the trajectory, while still slow and halting by any human sense of time, was consistently upward. It would take considerably longer, still something in the range of 10 to 15 million years after the initial extinction, before mammals began producing the kind of truly enormous forms that echo in scale, if not in shape, the great dinosaurs that had come before them. Creatures like Indracotherium, a hornless relative of modern rhinoceroses that eventually grew to become one of the largest land mammals ever to exist, standing taller at the shoulder than a modern giraffe and weighing many times more than any elephant alive today, would not appear until this later chapter of mammalian history, tens of millions of years removed from the extinction event itself. This detail is worth sitting with quietly because it reveals something genuinely important about how the story of life on Earth actually works, as opposed to how we often imagine it working. There was no dramatic handoff, no single generation in which mammals simply stepped into the role dinosaurs had vacated. There was instead an almost unimaginably long and gradual process spanning what amounts to roughly 1/10 of the entire length of the age of dinosaurs itself, during which mammals slowly, tentatively, and with no guarantee of success at any given stage, worked their way toward a scale and diversity that would eventually rival, though never quite exceed, what had come before. There is a genuinely open question tangled up in this slow rise, one paleontologists continue to investigate without full agreement. Why did it take so long specifically? Some researchers point primarily to the ecological explanation we have already discussed, the simple unavailability of the plant communities and stable food webs that larger animals require. Others argue that a more significant constraint may have been genetic and developmental, suggesting that the biological pathways enabling truly large body size in mammals may have themselves needed considerable evolutionary time to develop properly, quite apart from whether the ecological opportunity existed. The honest answer, as is so often the case in this kind of research, is probably some combination of both factors working together, though researchers continue to disagree meaningfully about which pressure mattered more at which particular stage of this long recovery. While all of this was unfolding on land, something equally significant and in some ways even more surprising was happening within the ocean, a detail that rarely receives the attention it deserves in popular retellings of this story. Whales among the most extraordinary success stories to emerge from this entire period descend directly from small land-dwelling mammals, distant relatives of modern hippos, that began venturing tentatively into shallow coastal waters roughly 49 million years after the extinction event. A lineage that would, over the following tens of millions of years, gradually lose its legs, develop the capacity for deep sustained diving, and eventually produce the largest animals ever to exist on this planet. Larger even than the greatest of the sauropods that once walked the Cretaceous floodplains. It is a strange and quietly moving thought, one worth pausing on here in the dark. The largest creature ever to live on Earth, the blue whale gliding through the ocean at this very moment, somewhere in the world owes its entire existence, however indirectly, to a small unremarkable mammal who survived a catastrophe by hiding underground patiently for reasons it could never have understood 66 million years ago. Is it not remarkable, when you sit with the full shape of this story, how little of it resembles triumph in any conventional sense? There was no moment of conquest here, no dramatic seizing of opportunity. There was only patience repeated across an almost incomprehensible span of time, small creatures quietly persisting through conditions. None of them had any capacity to understand generation after generation until persistence itself, slowly and without any single decisive turning point, became something that looks in hindsight remarkably like inheritance. And it is that inheritance, the long, quiet thread running from a frightened creature curled in a burrow all the way to the world you know today, including the very room you are lying in right now, that we turn to gently as this story begins at last to draw toward its close. There is one more piece of evidence worth sharing before we let this story rest, and it is in its own way the quietest and most affecting of everything we have gathered across the last several hours together. In rock layers dated just a few thousand years after the impact, considerably earlier than researchers once expected to find any sign of recovery at all, paleontologists working sites in North Dakota discovered something small and easy to overlook: a fossilized burrow, collapsed and preserved in ancient sediment, containing the remains of a mammal curled exactly as an animal curls when it is sheltering rather than simply resting. Nearby, in the same thin layer of rock, researchers found something else, a fern frond, one of the very first green things to return to that particular stretch of scorched earth. Two small unremarkable fossils, a hiding place, and a single new leaf sitting together in the same sliver of geological time-telling. Without any need for elaboration, the entire story we have spent these hours unfolding. Something endured, something began quietly to grow back, that is in the end the whole of it. We have spent a long time now with an empire that lasted 150 million years, and it is worth saying plainly one final time what that empire's ending actually teaches us, because it is not a lesson confined to dinosaurs or to deep time or to anything so distant it fails to touch the world you are lying in right now. Every dominant thing, every era that feels permanent from the inside, every arrangement of power that seems too vast and too deeply rooted to ever end ends. Not always through sudden violence, sometimes through slow volcanic strain building for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone notices. Sometimes through a single afternoon arriving out of a clear sky. The particular mechanism changes. The underlying truth does not. Nothing that lives, no matter how magnificent, is exempt from the possibility of an ending it cannot see coming. And yet this story is not in the end primarily a story about endings, however much time we have spent inside one. It is a story about what happens after, about the particular kind of resilience that has nothing to do with strength or speed or dominance, the qualities that mattered so enormously in the world before the fall. It is about patience instead, about small, unglamorous, easily overlooked creatures who survived not because they were exceptional, but because they were modest enough and quiet enough and adaptable enough to endure a world that no longer had any room for grandeur. There is something worth carrying with you in that long after this particular story has ended, and countless others have taken its place in your memory. Survival, real survival across the long arc of history has rarely belonged to the loudest or the largest. It has belonged again and again to whatever was patient enough to keep going through conditions it never chose and could not control. Consider for a moment everything that had to happen for you to be here listening to this at all. A small mammal had to survive an impact more violent than anything in human experience. Her descendants had to endure 1,000,000 years of ecological poverty most of us can barely imagine. Somewhere among them, tens of millions of years later, a lineage emerged that would eventually become primates, and somewhere within that lineage, considerably later still, something began that would eventually become us. None of it was guaranteed, none of it was owed. Every single step in that unbroken chain stretching back 66 million years to a burrow in the dark could have gone differently, and had it gone differently, even once this particular story, the one that leads to you, would simply never have happened at all. That is not a small thing to sit with as you drift towards sleep tonight. The forests came back eventually. Slowly, imperfectly, over millions of years, but they came back. The seas recovered too. Whales now swim through the same waters where mosasaurs once ruled, larger than any creature that has ever lived, descended from small-hooved animals who could not have imagined the ocean they would one day claim. Birds still sing in the mornings, carrying in their small bodies a lineage that outlasted every one of their enormous relatives. The world did not simply survive what happened. It became something new, something that could never have existed had the old world continued unbroken. There is a particular kind of dust that settles over everything eventually. Rock becomes soil, soil becomes forest. Forest becomes memory, and memory becomes, if we are careful and patient enough to look for it, a story like this one. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet corner of the world, something small is sheltering in the dark, waiting out conditions. It does not understand the way something small has always done since the very beginning. The light always returns. Rest now.